In this series of videos, I'm going to talk about hillbilly horror news. I'm going to tell you what it is, why you should be concerned about it, and how to protect yourself from it influencing you or your friends or colleagues to do something that is not in your interest. What is hillbilly horror news? Hillbilly horror news is frightening news stories about hillbillies, white trash, crackers, rednecks, generally people who purportedly live in small-town, rural America, often in Appalachia, areas like West Virginia, eastern Tennessee, the Smoky Mountains area. It has a long history both in news, and it's closely related to a genre of hillbilly horror fiction and movies. Movies like Deliverance with Burt Reynolds, for example, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's been lampooned, in fact. It is so common, the production of these movies that portray homicidal, psychopathic cannibals, in some cases, living out in the rural areas of America, who are often depicted attacking, killing, even eating city dwellers. Hillbilly horror news is news that communicates a very similar message to people in, of course, cities and urban areas, but also to some degree even people in rural areas. They don't want to be associated with those weirdo people that live out in the country or in a shack or a trailer park. Hillbilly horror news has soared in significance and frequency since the 2016 election campaign with Donald Trump, and he's often associated with hillbillies and other people that are typically, we can't even say lampooned, vilified in hillbilly horror news. Hillbilly horror news did not start with Trump. It's very old. It goes back decades. You can find examples of it in the 1950s and even earlier. In fact, there are sorts of examples of it way, way back, like the 1920s, when it was a little bit different. So modern hillbilly horror news portrays these people almost without fail as bigoted and racist. Whereas actually in the 1920s, they were portrayed as not racist enough, as intermarrying or intermixing with non-white peoples and threatening the purity of the white race. There were forcible sterilization cases like Carrie Buck, for example, in Virginia, where white people were targeted by eugenics fanatics. What's consistent in hillbilly horror all the way news is the low status, the vilification of these groups. There have been changes in the way that it works in modern years. Why you should be concerned about this is it appeals to deep-rooted prejudices we have, to our fear of other people and our fear of weird people who live up in the hills and do weird things, what we perceive as weird. And it can influence us ourselves to do something not in our interest, and our friends and colleagues and neighbors to do things without realizing they're being motivated by, in fact, bigotry and prejudice of their own. Instead of being prejudiced against, say, black people or other minorities, the targets are these weird people who live in the hills, these strange people in trailer parks, these people who, they don't want to be associated with. I'm going to go through in these videos some of the aspects of a classic example of hillbilly horror news, which is a series of documentaries that started with Paradise Lost, a documentary done by HBO by Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky about a horrific child murder case in West Memphis, Arkansas. It has many of the tropes, the cliches, the elements of hillbilly horror. It does not actually have the overt racial issues that occur in a significant fraction of hillbilly horror, but I'm going to focus on it in part because it doesn't have those elements, although there's some undertones of racial prejudices buried in the story. So my purpose is to show a historical and very effective example of this. This series of documentaries got a lot of attention, eventually gaining the support of many prominent Hollywood celebrities like Johnny Depp, Eddie Vedder, a whole bunch of people. Johnny Depp is probably the most famous. Well, he and Peter Jackson, who produced the Lord of the Rings movies. They really provided a substantial amount of publicity and apparently money that eventually resulted in the sort of release of the so-called West Memphis Three, Damian Wayne Eccles, Jason Baldwin and Jesse Miskelly, they're still technically guilty, convicted murderers. It's a very complicated case, and what I want to focus on is the sort of the cultural and political message and the misleading way in which Paradise Lost in particular, and much of the coverage, portrays the case. It is a classic example of hillbilly horror news. So I'm going to start this with a video discussing, which will follow, a video which discusses the use of the term small town. Okay, so West Memphis is described repeatedly as a small town, even though it had a population of about 28,000 people at the time of the murders in 1993. It was 10 miles from downtown center of Memphis, Tennessee, a big city that today has over 650,000 people. I'm going to discuss how it was presented in the movie or the documentary Paradise Lost as if it was a little town with maybe a few thousand people out in the middle of nowhere on a big highway. And I'll start with that as an example. And small towns and negative stereotypes of small towns play a big role in hillbilly horror news. One of the misleading aspects of Paradise Lost, the documentary, and more generally the presentation of what's come to be called the West Memphis Three case, or this murder case in West Memphis, Arkansas, is the description of West Memphis as a small southern town. This is the Wikipedia entry for Bruce Sinofsky, who was one of the producers of the famous Paradise Lost documentary and its successors. They ultimately did 3 of these documentaries, which played a substantial role in gaining public support for the 3 accused convicted murderers, Damian Wayne Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly. And time and again in accounts of this, West Memphis is described exactly as it is here in Wikipedia, as a small southern town. How true is that? Let's look at what small town conjures up. Here's Merriam-Webster, of or relating to a small town, coming from or living in a small town. Notice small town values, life, charm, small town girl. Here's Redneck, limited in outlook or experience, unsophisticated, provincial. It generally, in our culture, conjures up the image of a small community where everybody knows everybody else, often as in the stereotype conveyed in Paradise Lost, where the people are limited in outlook, experience, unsophisticated, and provincial. And that's very much the message of Paradise Lost. Let's look at what the U.S. Census says. This is a report from the census about small towns in America, a Nation of Small Towns, from May 21st, 2020. And in fact, they found a large fraction of the country lives in what they call small towns. And what do they mean by this? They're talking about, on average, small cities and towns with populations of less than 5,000 people. That's what they're talking about. They're using the language mid-sized cities, places with populations of at least 5,000, but less than 10,000 people. That's the language they use. In the popular cliche, we tend to think of small towns as probably smaller than 5,000 people. They're a community where everyone knows everybody else, at least can recognize their face, knows the name. That's pretty hard to do, even with 5,000 people in your town or your city. But nonetheless, it's very small. Well, what is West Memphis? Over here, we have Memphis, one of the biggest cities in Tennessee, if not the biggest. Today, Memphis has a population of over 650,000 people. It was a big city in 1993 when the murders occurred. West Memphis is just across the Mississippi River from Memphis. And in fact, it has another town next to it called Marion. And this is actually where Damian Wayne Eccles lived, who's the premier suspect who was sentenced to death, to lethal injection, and is kind of the Byronic anti-hero of the West Memphis Three story, the murders. So how big are these communities? Well, today, here we have West Memphis, and in 2010, for example, there were about 26,000 people living, this is the U.S. Census numbers, in West Memphis alone. So let's take a look at the historical data. This is from Biggest Cities USA, which gives the history. And it shows the population in 1993 is over 28,000 people living in West Memphis. Is that a small town? That's larger, for example, than the population today of Scarsdale, which is a suburb of New York City, not very far from New York City. It's over half the size of Hoboken, which is directly across the Hudson River from Manhattan in New Jersey. There are about 50,000 people living in Hoboken. Is that a small town? Marion was much smaller, but Marion had about 5,000 people, maybe 6,000, living there in the early 90s. So maybe you could call Marion a small town, but it's actually probably was over 5,000 people in 1993. Remember, it's kind of a secondary town to West Memphis. Let's go back to our map, and let's kind of zoom in on this area. So remember, this is very much like a suburban area of Memphis. It's not out in the boonies here. It is close to, there's farms and open fields and all kinds of stuff around here, certainly, but it's right across the river. It's 10 miles from the downtown area of Memphis, Tennessee, which is a huge city with over 650,000 people today. So let's zoom in, and I'll give a little bit more look at this. So where did the murders occur? Let me try to illustrate. The thing that the Paradise Lost does over and over again is show framing shots which appear to be along this highway. So this is where highways I-55, which goes north-south, and I-40, which goes all the way from North Carolina across the country to California, intersect here. And it is a major truck stop area, and the murders occur very close to a truck stop in West Memphis. And it's described and shown in the film in such a way that you might think it's just one of these little towns that you'll find if you drive across the country. There's a truck stop, and there's a small number of people living there who mainly make their living from the truck stops and, probably supporting some of the farming community around them. There's very little sense in the film, in the original documentary, and in many accounts, although they do occasionally mention it's right across the river from Memphis, Tennessee, your sense is this little rural community on the highway somewhere, and that's what it's about. But of course, as you can see, it's right across the river from this giant city, right? And it has, in fact, had a population of, again, let me just remind everybody of the population of West Memphis was actually probably over 28,000 people in 1993, and it's still like 26,000 or so today. So let's zoom in a little bit to think about the way that the movie or the documentary actually portrayed this. So let's zoom along here to, yes, here we are. Okay, the murders, well, the bodies were found, and presumably the murders occurred in what at that time was this area, which had essentially like a small woods or forest, and there's drainage ditches and other things here, and the bodies were dumped very sadly in possibly this diversion channel or another creek here. A lot of this I don't believe was there, and possibly here, somewhere up here, was the Blue Beacon truck wash, which played a role sort of in the accounting of it. And there's a neighborhood right next. This is where the families of the kids that were killed, they went to the Weaver Elementary School here, and two of the families lived about here, and one of the families lived down around here. Okay, so this is a pretty small area, as you can see. And so this was like a little neighborhood. And this is where a lot of the shooting is done, is this neighborhood here. And at the court cases, at the courthouses, which were actually in Jonesboro, Arkansas, and in Corning, Arkansas, 50 miles away. So there's very little sense. There's a couple of framing shots of some downtown areas or some, Pizza Huts and things like that. But every now and then they keep going back to showing this highway here, and so some music from Metallica. And so the sense you have from this kind of way the movie is, or the documentary, and I keep going back to movie because it tells a story like a movie, is that maybe this is the small town, right? The impression is created of a small town. Now, Damien and Jason Baldwin and Jesse Miskelly don't appear to have lived in this area. They lived in, well, Damien lived in a trailer park, at least most of his life, or in, let me go back here. So in Marion, actually somewhere up around here, apparently, the Lake Shore Mobile Home Park, or Lake Shore Estates Mobile Home Park, or something like that. But you only see a couple of neighborhoods in the entire, this huge, small city, basically, or mid-sized city, according to the U.S. Census language. So this is, again, Marion had around 5,000 to 6,000 people living in it. Marion is actually either never mentioned or very obliquely mentioned. In most of the accounts focus on West Memphis, even though Damien actually lived in Marion. And so let's take another look at this. And I'm trying to give more of a sense here of sort of what was going on. So the blue beacon is still in West Memphis, but it appears to have moved. So let me zoom in a little bit closer, and the map will show. This is the blue beacon now. And so, again, there's this intersection between I-55 and I-40. And there's all kinds of, today, and certainly back then, there are all kinds of motels and Ramada Inn, Econo Lodge, New Hampshire Inn, America Best Value for truckers and probably other people traveling every which way across the country around here. And this was one of the issues, whether the murders might have been committed by somebody, who was at the truck stop, actually, which was probably around here. And so this map, I'm using OpenStreetMap because it's open source, so it doesn't show like satellite images, that kind of thing. But what I'm showing is this is right where they were, and the kids apparently maybe went off into this area. We don't know what happened, obviously. It's a very sad story. These are mostly appear to be small detached family homes, not very pretentious, but that's the neighborhood. And by zooming in on this neighborhood and a couple of trailer parks, combined with this sort of language, the impression of a much smaller community is created in Paradise Lost, so a small southern town. Small town, the stereotype that we often have of small towns, and they proceed to heavily bang on these kind of stereotypes: limited in outlook, experience, unsophisticated, provincial. And I'll talk about that in other videos. So let's go back to the OpenStreetMap. I wanted to focus on one other thing that the map showed. Now, this may have changed. Of course, this is 2022. Notice there's an area here where there's a whole bunch of churches. That can be zoning and so forth. There's a real emphasis in Paradise Lost on the Christian, typically Baptist or Methodist churches, as if this is kind of weird to have churches in a residential area. There's an area like this on Middlefield Road in Palo Alto, where there's several churches, and one after another along a major road like this. It's not that uncommon, after all, in lots of communities, especially in residential areas, and this is a residential area. They make a lot of the Christian beliefs of the people, the parents, and the people in the community. And although it is nominally this sort of objective news reporting that was popular up until a few years ago, there's pretty clearly making fun of these people's religious beliefs and sending them up a bit in the documentary. And that's part of the story, which is that these, weird kids who listen to too much Metallica and dress in black became scapegoats for this murder. Now, was not that simple, and this is a way that they sort of present it as a small town with the impression you might get from watching the documentary is maybe a town of just a few thousand people with very unsophisticated police who are bumbling around and so on. Well, there may be, in a way, some truth to that, but again, this is a community of roughly 28,000 people, just West Memphis. And Marion, which is right next door, literally within walking distance, is probably at least 5,000 people in 1993. So in this particular case, the use of the term small town is really not appropriate. And this is one of the things with Hillbilly Horror news, is that it takes something that doesn't actually fit the full stereotype and converts it into. So a mid-sized city becomes a small southern town. That's just one example of how Hillbilly Horror news misrepresents reality.
Our censored search website and service enables you to search censored and shadow banned websites for suppressed information. We offer transparency on what the search ranking algorithms are doing and tools to help you separate fact from disinformation. We offer both a free service for everyone and a paid professional service with full access to our tools and the ability to customize the search algorithms for your needs. Our business model is end-user funded to avoid either direct control or subconscious bias from advertisers. Our censored search service is intended as a complement to increasingly censored advertising-funded search engines, such as Google, Yahoo, Bing, and even DuckDuckGo, which appears to be increasingly shadow banning alternative content. We cannot duplicate many useful features of the advertising-funded search engines yet, nor is this needed. Use our search engine for censored and shadow-banned content. Get the other side or sides of the story. Remember, there are often more than two sides to a story. Inclusion in our search engine is not an endorsement. We include sites based on evidence of censorship or shadow banning in our judgment. We attempt to be neutral and provide tools to our users to evaluate and verify the content without relying on our fallible judgment. There is evidence that powerful interests actively spread disinformation to alternative sites to make identifying suppressed factual information difficult and discredit factual information through guilt by association. We are developing tools to fight these active disinformation tactics. Give us a try at censored-search.com, censored-search.net, or censored-search.org. We welcome constructive feedback. How can we serve you better? Bookmark our site as the censorship is growing by leaps and bounds. You may need us more in the future. Let your friends and colleagues know. You can access more advanced features and support development of a transparent, verifiable search engine that works for you and not giant advertisers such as Big Pharma by becoming a paid subscriber. If you want to support our development work, subscribe now. This concludes this video presentation. If you like this video, please click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. You can avoid internet censorship by subscribing directly to our RSS news feed. Please consider sharing the link by email and on your website or blog, in addition to liking, upvoting, or sharing on increasingly censored, advertising-beholden, big company social media. We have encountered such censorship. Mathematical software is developing algorithms and software to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and increasing the predictive power of the results. You can support our work financially by subscribing on our Patreon page, https://www.patreon.com/mathsoft, or scanning the QR code in the lower right corner.